Another problem is one that's all over the front pages, namely strong regional opposition, even from Kuwait, which of course has been exacerbated by the recent U.S.-Israeli operations in the West Bank. And they are joint operations. That's well understood in the region, even if a different story is preferred here. The story preferred here is that I already mentioned Washington's renewed steps last December to bar the obvious measures to reduce violence, and it takes considerable discipline not to see what seems obvious to commentators elsewhere, particularly in the Middle East, namely that Powell's mission was very carefully crafted to ensure that the man of peace would have time to complete his terrorist operations in the newly occupied Palestinian cities. Now, it's true that the president insisted that he must withdraw without delay, but Powell was quick to explain in a press conference right away that the words "without delay" mean as soon as possible. It kind of recalls Clinton's deliberations on what "is" means, which you may remember. The man of peace is not asked to renounce terror, and of course the master in Washington. Rather, it's the adversary who's imprisoned by Israeli tanks, unable to flush his toilet. He has to renounce terrorism in terms acceptable to the master, even though everyone understands that those statements are completely meaningless, have no effect whatsoever. Why? Well, the story's familiar. Again, it's useful to look back a bit. Powell, who's the administration's good guy, is following the model of Secretary of State George Shultz, who was the official moderate back then in the Reagan years. This at a time when the United States was becoming an object of international ridicule in the late 80s because of its unwillingness to hear that the PLO was calling for negotiations and political settlement with increasing intensity, while the United States and its Israeli ally were refusing on the alleged grounds that the PLO had not renounced terrorism, unlike, say, the United States and Israel, which can't carry out terrorism by definition. In his memoirs, Shultz recalls all this with pleasure. He describes how he informed the President Reagan, that Arafat had said unk, and kol, but he hadn't yet said uncle with sufficient humility to be acceptable to Massa. The purpose is humiliation and degradation, not of Arafat specifically, but of the Palestinians as a whole, for whom he's a national symbol, and they have to be taught that they cannot lift their heads in standard Israeli parlance. 20 years ago, during another one of the periodic outbursts of state terror in the occupied territories, a very respected centrist commentator in Israel, Yoram Perry, wrote that 15 years, that's what it was then, 15 years of occupation have taught Israeli soldiers that the task of the army is not only to defend the state in the battlefield against foreign enemy, but to demolish the rights of innocent people because they are Arabushim, living in territories that God promised to us. Arabushim is the Hebrew word that's the equivalent of niggers or kikes. He and others were horrified not only by the vicious brutality, but also by the techniques of humiliation. For example, writing identification numbers on arms of prisoners on the day of the Holocaust, which is a practice renewed in the past few weeks, again arousing horror. 10 years before that, Moshe Dayan had informed his cabinet colleagues that the Arabs must be told that they will live like dogs in the hope that they will leave. And ever since then, the U.S.-Israeli practice has followed the advice of one of the leaders who was actually most sympathetic to the Palestinian plight. Well, none of this breaks new ground. These are familiar elements of domination and repression. Humiliation and degradation are at their core. Comes second nature to anyone with their boot on someone's neck. It's well known to anyone who's studied the history of imperialism and conquest. And it's not at all surprising that the United States and Israel should now be infuriated by their loss of a monopoly of violence and terror, though by virtue of their power they remain well in the lead. Well, the official justification for the perpetuation of many years of repression and terror is that the Palestinians rejected the magnanimous and generous offer of Clinton and Barack at Camp David in the year 2000, so they deserve their fate. And there's a simple way to evaluate that claim, very simple. Have a look at a map. Okay. Unfortunately, it's a difficult task to carry out because none were published, which is interesting. It's not that it's hard to publish map. You want to know if the offer was magnanimous? Take a look at the map. That'll tell you. It's easy enough. I mean, they were published in Israel, in the Israeli press. They were published in marginal publications here. And unless there's something to conceal, they would have appeared regularly on the front pages here, along with the chorus of self-praise about our magnanimity. And a look at the maps reveals very quickly why they did not appear. It is true that the Clinton-Barack offers registered some progress. At the time of the negotiations, Palestinians in the West Bank were confined to over 200 isolated cantons, and the magnanimous offer reduced it to 4. Therefore, it approached from below, remember, it approached from below the moral level of South Africa in the depths of apartheid 40 years ago, when the first Bantustans were established. Bush and Powell have regressed even below that. They are offering no more than a vision of what South Africa actually implemented 40 years ago. There's also been no change in the intentions, which are openly announced, described by Barack's chief negotiator at Camp David, Shlomo Ben-Ami, one of the architects of the Camp David Accords and a dove in the Israeli spectrum. He explained, just before joining the government in 1998, he explained the intention of the Oslo process, namely to create a neo-colonial dependency for the Palestinians in the occupied territories with permanent dependence on Israel, meaning the U.S.-Israel alliance, so Bantustans. And the analysis is correct, and it should have also made headlines right along with the unpublished maps and along with the actions which were taken at the time to drive the point home. The final Clinton-Barack year, in that year, settlement programs expanded to their highest peak since 1992, pre-Oslo, under Sharon. Well, you take a look at history, it again reveals the continuity of policy. So right now there's a great deal of interest in the Saudi peace plan, which was adopted by the Arab League in March. And this is regularly described here as a historic opportunity if only the Arab states will at last accept the existence of Israel, as in fact they have repeatedly done, along with the PLO, since January 1976, when they joined the rest of the world in backing a Security Council resolution which called for a political settlement based on Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories with, I'm quoting it, appropriate arrangements to guarantee the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of all states in the area and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized borders. So that's in effect UN 242, the basic document, amplified to include a Palestinian state. As usual, the resolution was vetoed by the United States, which is a double veto. It vetoes it from history. Similar initiatives have regularly been blocked by Washington right to the present. A majority of Americans also support the political settlement that is now reiterated in the Saudi plan, but unless they undertake a research project, Americans cannot know that the primary barrier to the diplomatic settlement that they support happens to be the Washington-Israel alliance, as it's been for 25 years, actually longer if we look closely. Well, unless this changes, and that means changes right here, the prospects there are for descent into even more bitter tribal warfare with ominous consequences that are likely to spread well beyond.